we've alluded to, we didn't mention her, but we've sort of alluded to her, Dallas Brody.
Mm.
She's, I'm sure you know who she is. She
Yep,
was
yep, yep,
removed.
yep.
Yeah.
She's not
So
the one
her
I'm
kind of,
referring to.
the black mark over her name, the great controversy with her relates to the Kamloops Residential School. What are your feelings on her then? Because I mean, she was kicked out of the party because we should say she argues there's no bodies. Well, it's not an argument; it is true. Um, no bodies were found. It was just anomalies in the ground. 215 suspected grave sites. That's considered beyond the pale, even on the right of and the so-called populist right in British Columbia. And then we have the likes of yourself there. You know, you just called yourself a liberal, small L liberal. You also are in agreement with her there. I mean, is that because of is British Columbia just is it some kind of mass delusion or what how do you see that specifically related to the attitude in British Columbia?
So this is a big topic, and maybe it's good that we save it to the end because it's such a big topic that it kind of, once you start talking about it, it's hard to talk about other things. So as everybody watching this knows, in late May 2021, Kamloops First Nation announced the discovery of what were presumed to be 215 child graves. And the media credulously reported that these were Indigenous children who were snuffed out in some way, and then buried, presumably under kind of sinister or secret circumstances. Back when residential schools were still operating, of course, there was a major residential school in Kamloops. And at the time, everybody, including me, believed that this story was true. And I believe the story was true because the history of residential schools in Canada is a terrible story. And there were at least, I think, 3,200 children who died after attending residential schools. This has nothing, that statistic is based on a well-researched Truth and Reconciliation report, and the real number is actually probably higher. A lot of people were absolutely credulous of this, as I say, including me. And then it emerged that what actually had been found with ground-penetrating radar were 215 soil anomalies. That is, anomalies in the density of the soil that is detected with ground-penetrating radar, and these could be graves. They also could be rocks. They could be irrigation pipes. They could be trenches that were made from old efforts to find graves. It has now been more than 4 years since that announcement, and is now very clear that there are no graves. The Kamloops First Nation was supplied with abundant funds and time to explore the property. Not a single grave has been found. It doesn't mean no grave will ever be found, but if there were 215 graves, we'd know it by now. So Canadian media entered a strange state of limbo after that because no one wanted to be the first to say, okay, so where are the graves? Are you going to start shoveling, like forensic methods? One of the people in hazmat suits going to come and start looking for remains? And the Kamloops First Nation was very tight-lipped about it, and they received all this money. And I looked around at my Canadian colleagues, and I saw that very few of them, people just wanted to kind of move on. It was like, well, the Canadian press said this was the story of the year for 2021. I think it was December 2021. They said, the unmarked grave story is the story of the year. It awakened Canadians' consciousness. End of story. Let's move on to other subjects because we're done with that. And it's absolutely true that the nature of the Canadian political and journalistic establishment, we're not like England. We're not like the United States, where there is a critical mass of people who say, well, wait a sec, let's revisit that. There is a herd mentality. And because I work for an Australian publication now, I live in Toronto, but I work for Quillette, I was at liberty to ask the kind of questions a lot of people ask. And I've written numerous articles for Quillette, and thankfully I've helped get the story out. So now you have the New York Post, you have the Wall Street Journal, British newspapers, Quillette itself, We've been a leader in this field, like that have basically educated an international audience. I was interviewed by a Danish newspaper about this. A Polish, the Polish equivalent of 60 Minutes, I've been told, interviewed me about this. They did a story about this. And so the world now knows that 215 graves have not been found. Canada now knows that 215 graves have not been found. It's this weird thing where everybody knows 215 graves have not been found, but you're not allowed to say it. There's no other story in Canadian journalism like this. None. And I think in the rest of Canada, you can now talk about it. There have been surveys. It's talked about openly in Eastern Canada, although it's still stigmatized. As I understand it, people in British Columbia are still living in late May 2021 as if those 215 graves have been found and as if 215 little skeletons have been unearthed, as opposed to nothing, which in fact is what has been unearthed. And again, I don't really know what to compare it with because there is no comparable story in Canadian media. And what I will say, because I'm going to bring this back to Dallas Brody, there is a way to talk about this and talk about what I have just said without being insensitive and without suggesting that you're casting the entire residential school narrative into question. And this is an issue I've had with people like Frances Widdowson, who's a former academic who has written books. She's gotten into all these contretemps on campuses because they bring her to speak. Because some of the same people who say what I have just said, and I stand by every word of what I just said, will also say, and this just proves the entire Indigenous industry is a hoax and that residential schools weren't that bad, and you know, reconciliation is BS, and that's not helpful, and it's typically not accurate. You can say residential schools were a stain on the Canadian conscience, while also saying, but 215 little child bodies were not found in Kamloops in May 2021. You can walk and chew gum. Now, in BC, you cannot, because...
And two things can be true at the same time.
In reality. Now, in British Columbia political culture, in 2025, you cannot. You try and walk and chew gum, and you fall on your face. But that's your weird political culture where reconciliation has become this weird kind of quasi-religion. So it's like questioning the doctrine of transubstantiation in a Catholic theocracy. That's what BC now is. And so I'm sympathetic to Dallas Brody because she's the person who's gotten up and said, this is BS, this is nonsense, we need to say it. But there's a way of saying it, and I don't want to be too hard on Dallas Brody because she's obviously been kind of politically traumatized by her treatment from her colleagues, and she's been absolutely thrown under the bus by her leadership. But what happens and I've seen this often in the culture wars, because Colette publishes a lot of authors who are kind of people who are saying things like the things that you're not supposed to say, but which are true. Those people become radicalized, and they then go in for sort of what I would say more theatrical and maybe unhelpful gestures. So I saw a picture on social media where Dallas Brody, she had a sign that said zero bodies.
Yeah.
That's not helpful.
Right.
The sign is accurate. The gesture is not helpful. And I don't want to criticize her because, again, she's been through a lot. And she's, from what I've seen, what she said is the truth. But there's a delicate way to stand up in church and say, I don't believe this dogma. I respect your movement. I respect the underlying sentiments, but I don't believe the dogma. And that's my view on Dallas Brody.